everyone, and welcome to GEMA Talks. And I want you to welcome our guests on this installment, Tedd Cittadine from Roku. Tedd is the Vice President of Content Partnerships at Roku. Had a long career in the entertainment media industry, a number of years at Fox, where we first met. And I'm particularly excited to have Tedd with us because he's really our first guest who's purely playing in the digital streaming space, particularly in the advertising, streaming and on-demand world. And for those who follow that space, you'll know that it's just experiencing exploding growth. Roku itself has become just a huge player in that world. And so excited to get Tedd's perspective and also speak about his interesting career path. So Tedd, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too, Rich. I appreciate it.
As we continue our COVID remote world here. Hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, to start off our interview, I thought it'd be instructive to go back actually really to the beginning of your career. You're a Midwestern boy. You were born in South Bend, Indiana, grew up there, went to Miami University in Ohio for college, and then did corporate banking out of college. And then I believe is when you then started thinking about an MBA, correct?
That's right. That's right. Exactly. All that's correct. It's actually Elkhart, Indiana. We're right next to South Bend. So
okay.
Close to Notre Dame there. But yeah, all of that is right. And then looked for my MBA, and then Georgetown was the top choice.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about why Georgetown. What made you attracted to Georgetown? And then after that, would love to hear how that experience went, what kind of impact that program had for you.
Yeah, so Georgetown, I'd always been really interested in it as a place to go. I think undergrad for me, come from Indiana, I didn't want to go that far from home. Then after spending 4 more years in the Midwest, I wanted to go very far from home. So I had always really admired Georgetown and always been really interested in a couple of the things that Georgetown brought. They brought this great location in the world that had a lot of sort of dynamic participation from a lot of international elements, a lot of business elements, and just seemed to me sort of at the epicenter of a lot of really interesting things happening in both the business world and the political world at the time. And so I think that really drew me to Georgetown. I didn't know much about the program. I just kind of knew the name of the school and knew the reputation of the school and knew really the international focus. So the more and more research I did, the more and more I talked to people and visited, it really, for me, just turned out to be a really good fit. So decided to go at the ripe old age of 23. I was the second youngest person in my class when I started there. I was kind of bright-eyed and a little intimidated, but it just turned out to be a phenomenal experience for me personally and then professionally as well.
What specifically do you highlight within that experience that you feel is so memorable and so impactful?
Yeah, just the access to the people that I got on campus. Again, being from Indiana, I had studied abroad in college, but really kind of having the access to the sort of people that you meet at Georgetown, whether it's your fellow students, we're all remarkable. I was always kind of amazed. I'm this kid from Indiana, and there are these remarkable people and with these remarkable backgrounds from all over the world. A third of our class was international. Some really great experiences, and then just the faculty was such another huge plus of getting sort of the sort of level of people that were experts in their field, which was really interesting. And then being there and being part of the DC culture, just getting speakers like Bill Clinton came to speak to us right after he left office, and Bill Gates, and you had so everyone that made a swing through DC that was notable typically came and talked to Georgetown. So you had these access to people that you'd never have access to otherwise. So that was really cool experience.
Yeah. So when you were graduating Georgetown, where were you thinking of taking your career next?
Yeah, it's interesting. So this is way back in the day of 2000. So it was a different world in some ways back then. I had gone to school. I was a financial analyst going before school and gone to school, and I was going to be an investment banker. That's what I had planned to do since I was 13. But it was right around the time I went to school. It was in 1998 I started. And that's with the dawn of Internet 1.0. And it was just such a tremendously interesting and dynamic time for someone that was in school and getting ready to go out. You remember those days? Yeah. A lot of fun. And so I interned instead of at an investment bank, which I had an offer to. I interned at a company called The Motley Fool, which was the big startup at the time in DC. And just really had a great experience. And so decided that after school, I wanted to pursue the kind of startup tech route. And I had loved living in DC and wanted to stay there, didn't want to move. And so I found a fit locally in DC afterwards and just started from there.
Yeah, and you were at AOL during a probably pretty interesting time because I think they had done the merger with Time Warner at that point.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, so I started at a satellite broadband company right out of school, startup there, raised a few $100 million for Microsoft and Dish Network. Then I went to AOL and worked in their M&A team, like you said, right after the merger. That was a historic merger in a lot of ways, good and bad.
Famous and infamous all in one.
That's right. That's right. And had a really good experience there for a couple of years. Working in their M&A team, and then had the experience and the opportunity of Fox was looking for someone in their strategic planning group that had M&A experience, also tech experience, and so I decided to interview for that role in LA at the movie studio, and never really thought about that, and that's where my career took the sort of the entertainment turn.
Yeah, so I mean that. I was thinking about it when we talked earlier. You get this kid from the Midwest, and suddenly you're walking, the halls of the Fox studio, and then you're walking by movie sound stages and by actors and actresses in the commissary with all these celebrities and such. It must have been, what was that like? I mean, it must have been quite a change and quite an interesting change.
Yeah, it was super cool. It was just a really interesting time to be in the movie business. When I started at Fox was 2006. The dawn of digital was just kind of happening, where iTunes was just starting to distribute content digitally. Amazon was just getting
right.
into it. It was the phase of just after Napster. We didn't know if people consume content legitimately digitally. And so being in corporate strategy and strategic planning was a really interesting time, because I got to evaluate a lot of these things as they were happening in corporate strategy. As you know, Rich, Fox corporate strat planning is the stepstone to greatness in one's career. As you know personally. So it was a really fun place to be in, a tremendous amount of learning. You got to learn a bunch of stuff about what the company was doing in general, which is really, really fun place to be.
And, you made a transition at that point into one of the divisions, which I think is important to note, because people who start in strat planning, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes people who work in strat planning, they end up working in strat planning their whole career. They're more strat planning, business development type people, and that's sort of the environment they want to be in. I think you really did want to sink your teeth in more of an operating group, right? And you obviously must have been involved in the corporate strat planning group with some things in digital distribution, and suddenly next thing you find yourself in that group, right?
That's right. It's exactly right. Where we got to work, the privilege of working across the studio on a lot of different projects. Studios working at the time. We worked on a pricing project for iTunes when we were first starting to distribute digitally. How much we charge, and what our cost structure would look like. And I really enjoyed that project from a strategic standpoint. And just as part of looking at the market analysis, I thought to myself, okay, if there's one part of the studio that I would bet on that's going to grow in the future, it would be digital at that time, which meant transactional VOD pay-per-view movies at the time. It was the only digital business out there. And so that was the division I thought that's the place I wanted to be, to go into an operating role, and made that move in 2009, maybe 3 years or so after I joined Fox, and started operating that business for a number of years.
And at the beginning, it wasn't television shows. It was just movies.
That's right. It was just movies. There's TV that followed on shortly thereafter. You could buy on an individual episode basis. But yeah, it was predominantly movies starting out, and it was certainly a different business model than we have today. There was no Netflix streaming. There was just Netflix physical, and it was just a drop in the bucket of the overall studio's P&L at the time.
Yeah, just especially for our younger audience, just paint the picture, because 2006, 2007, 2008 doesn't sound like that long ago, but in the world of digital distribution for entertainment product, was really kind of the early days. Paint a picture of, back then it was still kind of all new, right? You were kind of blazing trails, and the business models were all new, right?
Yeah, it was before the iPhone existed. Yeah. So that's, it was the dark ages back there. And, I remember our first year in digital, or, very first first year we were generating $2 million, and people would laugh at us in the DVD team. They would say like $2 million, that's our lunch budget for one of our movies. And so that's really what it was. And again, people weren't sure if people would consume digitally, if piracy was going to kill everything.
Right.
And so, the benefits of Apple that they did for music and kind of what they did for video as well is they proved that there is a legitimate marketplace of buyers if you have the right platform and if you have the right product to do that. And so that was really, really helpful. Now, the business model has changed a lot since then, but the fact that they were able to prove that model was very successful.
Yeah. So as you said, you were in that group and rose, quite high in that group. And, like a lot of people who have been at a company for a long time, who are kind of mid-career, you had a bit of a fork in the road in deciding what you wanted to do next, right? Because you got approached by Roku about potentially working there, which at the time was still a relatively new company. Talk about what the two options were, right? Because there was going to Roku, or you could have probably stayed at Fox, right? So talk a little about those options and why you elected to go to Roku.
Yeah. So I had really great experience at Fox, and I was managing the digital business and worked there for maybe 10 years or so. And I had worked with Apple early on and worked with Amazon early on, Google early on in their life cycle of becoming a digital business in video and entertainment. And I kind of kicked myself because I thought, those were these companies that were doing these really interesting things.
Yeah.
And they grew to be these massive companies. And a lot of that was based on content from Fox and others, where they were able to successfully use that content and grow their businesses and their platforms to be these great, valuable assets. And Netflix is a great example of doing that.
Sure.
And I thought to myself, okay, well, when the next one of those comes around, that will be my chance. And if I ever find one of those, that's going to be worth leaving Fox for. And so had looked for a long time and tried to find the right company that I thought was well positioned and had a good management team, a great product, very strong engineering. And Roku seemed to check all those boxes. The only regret I have is I didn't go there a few years earlier, but timing was good and it came up and it was a hard decision. People say, oh, that was easy by hindsight, but this was before the Fox merger. And Roku was not.
Yeah, there were people telling you you're crazy. You work at one of these biggest studios on the planet, and you have this incredibly, major job there, and you're protected and all this, right? So you probably got to heard a lot of that.
Yeah, exactly. And Roku was not public yet, and so it was just a different era back then. But decided like this is what I want to do, and I felt like if I didn't do that, then I would just work at Fox for a long time, and I really wanted to learn something. So it wasn't about making more money, or it wasn't about any title or something. It was just really about learning something that I thought would be interesting and would grow in the future. And I think for students out there, that's what I'd recommend. At least when you're early in your career, focus on something that you like and that you think that has growth opportunities and that can add a skill maybe that you don't have or that you'd like to develop at some point. So that's what led me to Roku, and that was 4 years ago, and it's been a crazy ride ever since.
Yeah, I want to set the stage a little for those who may not be as familiar with Roku. I'll have you explain all the pieces of Roku, but what I want to explain is this is a company that when Ted got there, it was still a private company, quite valuable, but still private and a relatively good sized player in the market. But then they went public in, I think, late 17, early 18. And I think it was at $1 billion something valuation. Fast forward 4 years, and Roku is now almost a $50 billion market cap company. So, I mean, a true juggernaut really in the business today. And it's probably been pretty wild to see that in the 4 years you were there. But why don't you talk a little bit about the main pieces of what make up Roku, and then talk about what your role at Roku, how it's evolved, what kind of started, how it's evolved, and what you do now at Roku.
Sure. So it's a good question, because I think the average consumer probably understands Roku better than maybe the average media CEO.
Yeah.
I think when the average media CEO thinks about digital or platforms, they'll think of Apple or they'll think of Google.
Yeah.
And they'll be shocked to realize that we're 5 times bigger than Apple TV's platform, or 6 times bigger than Google's platform. And our company, to look at it very simply, is we have 2 components of our company. We sell hardware, we sell our streaming players, and we license our operating system to dozens of TV OEM manufacturers. And that generates an active account, that generates a user that uses the Roku platform. And then the other side of the business, we call that the platform business. It's basically monetization. So once someone uses our device or uses our television operating system, then we derive value from that user. And so in the platform business, there's three areas or verticals of value where we concentrate on. The first is ad sales, where we have a direct ad sales team that sells advertising on the Roku platform to TV buyers. And we think we do that better than anyone else, given the data that we have. The second is our programming function. We have our own service and channel on Roku called the Roku channel. It's one of the largest advertising supported video channels out there with film and TV content. So that's our other big revenue generating vertical. And then the third is the content business. And that's the business that I manage. And to think about that business simply, it's the entire business around the channels on Roku. So the revenue and economics we derive from an Amazon or an Apple TV Plus or Netflix or Hulu, Disney Plus, all of those channels, it's negotiating the distribution agreements with them. It's ensuring that they're successful on our platform. We're helping them build audience through our on-platform marketing techniques. It's also acquiring content. One of my teams acquires content for the Roku channel in support of that business. And then three technical product management teams, partner engineering teams, and partner management teams that help our partners build great channels and publish those channels to Roku. So that encompasses the entire business of content on Roku that I manage.
So for instance, I know when HBO Max came out, there was a lot of news where you weren't carrying it, but then you cut a deal with them. So that means if I go on my Roku device, there'll be an HBO Max tile there. And if I'm interested in HBO Max, I could subscribe for it right then and there off of Roku. Correct.
Exactly.
And then you guys get some kind of economic benefit from that with HBO Max.
That's right. Exactly. So when someone subscribes through Roku to a subscription service like HBO Max, we get a share of that monthly subscription revenue that's generated from Roku. If someone rents a movie on demand or pay-per-view event, we get a slice of that transaction. These services may choose to market, and we have on-platform performance-based marketing techniques to acquire users. So that's how we derive value from our partners. And then as part of our distribution agreements, we typically have advertising sharing agreements where you could be watching a channel that could be a channel from CBS or a channel from someone else. Just a hypothetical example, nothing particular. But if that goes to commercial, oftentimes Roku could be selling that commercial directly versus that channel, and then we share in the revenue that we derive from that.
And
so that's how we operate as well.
Yeah, and so again, for the audience, why don't you explain to them this massive shift that's happening of ad dollars from sort of traditional broadcast and cable networks over to platforms like Roku, and talk a little bit about the advantages an advertiser gets when they advertise on a digital addressable platform like that versus, CBS, NBC, ABC.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We all know, as we've seen the trends of the last few years, where people are cutting the cord, they're leaving cable, and they're going to streaming because it's lower cost. It's a better experience oftentimes in the UX. And now there's a lot of content that's amazing that can only be viewed on streaming in Disney Plus, like The Mandalorian or all of Netflix, or
and you can watch it on demand whenever you want.
Exactly, watch it on demand. Exactly. So all those benefits are driving this secular shift, and we feel that the pandemic kind of accelerated that secular shift into streaming. So you have a smaller audience on TV today, a larger audience on streaming. We're seeing the shift of ad dollars go from TV to streaming. Now, that shift of ad dollars hasn't caught up with the amount of people that are streaming yet, which we saw the same phenomenon in mobile, where you had a bigger audience on mobile and the ad dollars were slower to come over to mobile. And so even today, we still feel like there's a ton of upside because the dollars haven't caught up with the people that are actually streaming. And we feel the benefits, like you asked, for streaming is that we have a one-to-one direct relationship with our consumer, logged in relationship, which is very important, and also a data relationship with that consumer, an opted in data relationship. So in television today, it's really hard to target, and you can just try and target. I want to maybe target an 18 to 34-year-old demo if I'm looking for trying to capture a new parent with like a baby food or diapers ad. In streaming, we can get much more granular. And instead of that general demo, we can really target a demo specifically for what the advertiser wants. In this case, we can have data that indicates what channels are people watching, or look at purchase history on their credit card or other things, and aggregate data about our audiences to have a segment of new parents that are out there specifically shopping for that product you're advertising. And that's not only much more efficient if you're an advertiser, but it's much more valuable. And there's a premium to be able to target users in the way that we can.
And I don't know if you can do this yet, but I'm sure you'll get to the point too, where you can even have them take an action, right? So you can even say at the end of the diapers ad, you could say, if you'd like to get a 10% coupon on your next diaper purchase, click here, and then it takes you to some website, and then you can activate there as well, right?
That's right, exactly.
It's something you just can't do in traditional analog television.
That's right. That's right. There's actions that you can take based on that because it's interactive. There's also tracking and measurement, which is really important. And today it's hard to measure in TV what dollars are working. But we have partnerships with retailers like Kroger, which we announced, a year, 18 months ago. And there was a study of Snyder's and Hanover, the pretzel company. And we were able to work with them and identify users that had been exposed to an ad and that went to Kroger. And they found that users that were exposed to an ad and went to Kroger bought Snyder's of Hanover pretzels 5 times more than people that didn't. And it gave them a 250% return on their marketing investment. And so you can never do that in TV. And if we can convince users and convince partners that they have that sort of ROI, like that's a huge step forward in advertising. And I would argue it's better for the consumer because you're going to unfortunately have to watch ads on all platforms. And if you can watch an ad that's more relevant to you, that's better. I would say that's better for everyone.
The other thing I heard during the pandemic, which is interesting, which is another benefit of platforms like yours, is obviously marketers were a bit paralyzed about, geez, I don't know where the pandemic's going. I don't know how bad it's getting. I don't know if I should pause my ad dollars. Should I double down in certain, if depending on the product, maybe you double down. If you're a heat lamp company, people were buying heat lamps, so you should double down. And what digital advertising, it allows them to get much quicker answers, much quicker feedback on how things are doing. So then they can course correct, which again is harder to do. Again, as someone who worked in the traditional cable network side for many years, it's much harder to sort of stop on a dime and say, okay, move this money on Tuesday and put it over here on Wednesday. You can do that in the digital space. And I thought that was a really interesting other point that someone made to me recently.
Yeah, it's a great point. Really good point.
Yeah. So, there are a lot of players chasing the kind of streaming dream, including Roku for many years. Like you said, a lot of behemoths who they compete with, but others as well. What do you think has been some of the keys to Roku's success? Because I'll tell you, if you ask people 6, 7 years ago, they're like, "There's no chance Roku can compete with all these guys, right? They're a tiny little dot on the spectrum." So, what has been the keys to success to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's interesting where there are stories of investors that were going to invest in Roku and then pulled out when the Chromecast was announced years ago. They thought it was going to kill Roku, and then there was always something that was going to kill Roku historically. It's a good question. I think one, it's like a singular focus that Roku has on streaming. We don't do anything else, and sometimes a challenge with these massive tech giants or tech monopolies, I don't know how you want to refer to them these days, that their businesses are so vast now that the market, even as big as streaming until recently, wasn't really interesting enough to them to commit a substantial amount of resources to it because they had such bigger businesses elsewhere. And so we've had only a singular focus on this. I think that's one. I think two, just have a really talented team. Our founder invented the DVR, Anthony Wood. He projected years ago that streaming would replace television. We're kind of now just catching up to his vision there. He built a team of super highly talented engineers. And when I joined the company, it was about 80% engineers. It's still a majority engineer today. So we have this technical culture and a really strong expertise there. And I think third is like we've relentlessly pursued the consumer interest of like better products at lower prices. We're always the lowest price out there. Every year we strive to think and we rack our brain to determine how low of a price we can make our hardware. And if you look at Apple, they just announced a new Apple TV. It's still $200. It's been $200 for years, and our entry-level product is $29. So it's our relentless focus on cost, which we believe is the exact same, if not a better experience for fractions of the price. It's hard to compete with that, and it's hard to, and that's why we're the mass market product that we are.
Yeah. What's coming up on the horizon, would you say, in terms of trends that either impact Roku or Roku's involved in actually leading the trends. What are some of the key trends that you see in the business as we look the next 3 to 5 years?
I think we saw it earlier on. We had sort of streaming 1.0 that was led by Netflix, who's still a force in the business with over 200 million users and growing still very, very strongly, particularly overseas. But we had the sort of the version 1 with Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, YouTube. And now we're seeing sort of, the second wave of streaming being led by major media companies now that realize that the traditional TV ecosystem is in secular decline. Streaming is going to replace TV. So now they're all making large bets on streaming. Disney was the first. It's done phenomenal, 100 million users since they launched not even a year and a half ago. And we've seen HBO Max, Discovery Plus, now Paramount Plus.
Paramount Plus.
Yeah, exactly. Peacock. So now every major media company is launching their own direct-to-consumer streaming effort, which we think overall is good. I mean, more streaming, better for Roku. We're the market leader. They're producing great programming that can only be viewed on streaming. So we're pulling people faster from TV to streaming, which means it's a good thing for us. And also more competition. The more competition, the better on Roku. And so we think that's a trend that we are very, very much looking forward to going forward.
It's actually, I hadn't thought of it, but you really are kind of frenemies, if you will, because when Peacock launches or HBO Max launches, sure, that may take eyeballs away from the Roku channel or some other things on Roku, but you're also a place that people consume HBO Max and these other places. So it's people who have a Roku device in their home and nothing else, that's where they go to watch these streaming platforms on a connected television.
Yeah.
So what do you think is going to happen on the content side? You guys have now announced a few bets on original content. People may have heard that you guys bought the Quibi library, for instance. What do you think will happen on the content side? Any trends there? Do you see any more of this kind of original content or premium content going to streamers, particularly advertising-based streamers?
Yeah, I think I've just been amazed at the breadth and quality of content in streaming the last few years. I think the last number that I read from Analyst Report was that Netflix was now spending $20 billion a year. That's not much less than half of our market cap every year on content. And they're producing 70 original movies. And I think what that was, 70 original movies is probably the output of 60% of Hollywood at some point.
Yep. In one year.
In one year, exactly. And that's not in addition to all their TV,
right?
Incredible TV production. So just amazed at the quality and sheer output now of streaming and the production budgets of some of these with 15, 20 million plus dollars per episode. So all that is great for streaming because it's bringing eyeballs away from TV into streaming. So that's a trend that we've seen. That's nothing new. AVOD, I think we're very optimistic on AVOD. And I would say that because SVOD is incredibly competitive and incredibly now pronounced that those are the players that I think will be successful, or the players that we've seen which are Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and HBO Max now, and maybe a couple of these well-funded entrants. AVOD has been, I think, largely overlooked, or at least less competitive until now. And I think we've seen a tremendous amount of growth in AVOD. We're early on establishing our AVOD channel in 2017. And we think it's a great complement to these SVOD services. We're not competing with Game of Thrones type content. We're competing with content that works for an advertising-based window and an advertising-based economic structure. And at the end of the day, there's only so many of these subscription services people can afford. Right. They'll have time, they'll use AVOD services, and we've seen a tremendous growth in AVOD in the last few years because of those factors. So we're very optimistic about AVOD going forward.
So users and our audience should expect to maybe see some additional investments by you and some of the other AVOD streamers, you think, on content, original content.
Yeah, exactly. You've seen much more investment in AVOD in the last few years. And now, major media acquiring companies like CBS acquired Pluto, Fox acquired Tubi, and Amazon has launched their own AVOD service, IMDb TV. Yep. So there's a lot now more dollars going into AVOD because the opportunity is there and the audience and scale is there. And we would argue that we've got the audience, we have data, the ad sales team to really monetize AVOD, in our view, better than our competition because we have these competitive advantages.
I want to pivot for a second, talk a little bit about you and kind of your management style and operating style. Tell us a little bit about how what your belief in is, how you like to manage teams and build teams and develop teams. Are there some sort of important principles or tenets that you like to follow?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, coming from Fox is, I think was a very, good education in sort of traditional management skills. I had a great experience there. And I think there's just sort of a level of rigor in analysis and in sort of presentation that I think I took with me from Fox that was very important. So I like to think of, the people that I hire and the teams I build have this sort of analytical background. I have a bias to that. I have a financial analysis background. And so I think that's very important to have. And really at Roku, we have a culture that's very similar to Netflix. In fact, we were part of Netflix until 2009, until we spun out of Netflix, and our founder and CEO was briefly part of Netflix as well. And so we've taken a lot from their culture, which they have a very innovative and interesting culture, and there's some similarities there with Roku. And we have a belief that we have accountability. So we hire people that are professionals. We give them a latitude to make decisions. Very different than Fox. It's not a hierarchical structure, it's an empowered structure. And that's really refreshing. I think, and the opportunity is, if you're interested in growth and you want to execute and you have a lot of ideas and passion, you can do it at Roku. The downside of that is there's a lot of accountability at the same time. And a lot of times
wins and losses.
That's right. And you're accountable for doing what you say you're going to do. And, they hold you accountable to that. And so there's a downside to that for people that, don't execute or would want to thrive in an environment where there's less accountability or less direct action involved. And so it sort of takes the right kind of person that will do that. But the teams that I've put together have that, analytical or quantitative background, and that are people that just enjoy to execute and make decisions without a lot of bureaucracy, without a lot of sort of team or kind of cross-functional input, people that can just execute.
How is the remote environment impacted your day-to-day job? Maybe it hasn't that much, but I'd love to hear what in some ways maybe it's worked better. In other ways it's been, it's created some deficiencies, but curious how that's worked for you. I haven't seen your team in person in over a year.
Yeah, it's been a really, odd year to say the least. And I've always been a very large proponent of in-office work. The Fox environment was 100% in office. At Roku, it's interesting because we had a very strong office culture. We have 5 major offices in the US and growing. And it's our viewpoint that we had a very strong office culture, but we're so distributed that everyone would sort of naturally video conference anyway. I would fly up to Los Gatos, now San Jose, 2 days every week. So I was up there. So you never knew where people were going to be. So I always were video conferencing somehow. And so we've just sort of taken everyone online versus in the office. And it really hasn't changed our performance and hasn't changed everything. I think the interesting factor will be when we go back, a lot of my team that was remote or international or in a remote office before felt like they weren't connected. But now that we're all remote, I think that's leveled the playing field.
Yeah.
And so everyone can execute. And I don't think we have that same feeling because we're all equally disconnected or equally connected. When we go back to the office, and we will be doing that at some point, I think it'll be more challenging to how do we keep the remote people feeling as connected as the in-office people. That will be a challenge for us. But it's been relatively seamless, to be honest, going all remote. And we had to do it, but I think we've done a good job in doing it.
That's good. I'd like to finish off, which I usually do, with talking about some career advice. You had a couple of little nuggets you mentioned earlier in our conversation, but what are some other pieces of advice you have for people either looking to break into media or digital media or trying to advance their careers? What are some things you'd like to tell people?
Yeah, I think for Georgetown folks in particular, especially for students or new graduates, I would say, use your network in Georgetown to the fullest extent possible. And you have this beautiful opportunity when you're a student, whether you're an undergraduate student or graduate student, or even recently graduated, that you can use your network and it just can open all these doors for you. Because Georgetown, that's how I met you, Rich, was through the Georgetown network. You've been a really valuable connection. There's countless connections we made through Georgetown. And when you're a student, you have this wonderful opportunity because everyone wants to talk to a student. And so you've got a connection. So use that to your fullest extent possible. versus, when you're unemployed, no one wants to talk to you, but when you're a student, everyone wants to talk to you. So really use that when you have the possibility, and you go out of your way to connect with people, and offer to meet them, wherever they might be, offer to to be as flexible as possible whenever they can meet, and really go out of your way to try and connect with them, and always be on time, and always be prepared and ask good questions. These little things, I think, make a big difference.
Yeah.
So I think that's one place to start. Absolutely. And then second, I would just say, have an idea of where you want to go in the business. A lot of people, if you just say, I want to work in entertainment, it's really hard.
Yeah.
And so that's sometimes frustrating if you're trying to break in and you don't have a focus. But if you know you want to do your research and homework and say, I want to be in marketing, I want to work in digital, this kind of company, and then reach out to that person that has that job and try and connect with them and say, I'm interested in doing what you do. Tell me about like how you got there. And I think a lot of people, when you ask them for advice, you may often get a job, versus when you're asking for them job, you may often get advice. So I think I would, really kind of reach out to people and just ask them, how they've gotten to where they've been.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's a good point about sometimes people are a little too general, and when you're young, you maybe don't exactly know, but like you said, do your research. But secondly, too, I always say to people, what interests you, what areas interest you, right? So, do you seem to gravitate more to finance or marketing or the creative side, so find an area that you think is interesting. If you read articles on the web or business articles, which ones that do you find the most interesting? I always try to help guide people that way, because you're right. If you just say to someone, yeah, I just really want to work in media, it can be a little too boiling of the ocean, So
Exactly.
yeah, no, it's great. Well, great. Ted, this is awesome. Really appreciate the time, and just such an interesting story of Roku. There will definitely be books written about Roku and how they've been how they thrived during this whole period of the media history, and it's been really fascinating. And you're really sitting in the center and seeing a lot of the pieces of what's happening in this major transformation. So I'm sure that's quite exciting, and I'm sure it also means you're very busy.
Yeah, it's been fun. Well, who knows where will happen next, but it's been a fun time to be a part of it. It's been a great time to be a Georgetown graduate in Hollywood. There's a number of us out here,
Yep.
and the GEMA does a fantastic job of bringing us together, and just looking forward to continuing to connect with folks from Georgetown.
Yeah, we're looking forward to figuring out when our next in-person event, return to that world. So hopefully that'll be sooner than later.
Great.
Well, good luck with everything, Ted. Great talking, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks, Ted.